Hi everyone, thank you for joining our webinar, Dietary Interventions and Nutraceuticals for the Management of Mental Health. I'm excited to announce our panelist, Dr. Nenad Naumovski. Dr. Naumovski is a chef, food scientist, and molecular nutritionist who works at the University of Canberra in Canberra, Australia, as an associate professor in food science and human nutrition. He leads a functional foods and nutrition laboratory and holds academic conjoint positions as the visiting professor at the Harokopio University of Athens, Abertay University in Scotland, and University of Newcastle in Australia. Dr. Naumovski has a strong research interest in the effects of food and nutrients on psycho-cardiological markers associated with healthy aging. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Naumovski. Before you get started, I just wanted to remind everyone to please send your questions into the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as possible at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for your kind introduction. I'm just going to share a screen so we can actually see my presentation. And I hope that that is working well.
It looks good.
Fantastic. So yeah, thanks very much for your introduction. Welcome from Australia, or good day from Australia. Before we actually continue, I would just like to use this opportunity and to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people that are traditional custodians of the lands where the Bruce campus is situated. We also wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of Canberra and the region in Australia. In addition to all this, we also acknowledge all other First Nations people on whose lands we gather in this presentation, so wherever we are. When we start talking about the effects of a food and a dietary intake and nutraceuticals and components of the food, it's always important that we really look back and we try to understand what actually the food is and what is a reason, what is a basic concept of why are we eating. It's because of food, obviously, it is more than just a source of nutrients. It's providing us with satisfying the hunger. It's providing us for psychological, social, cultural purposes. The food is also linked to personal emotions, because it provides us with a comfort. It provides us with a feeling of achievement, a feeling of success. It is actually been recognized as one of the very first components in a food, in a human consumption, in a human development, where we are using a food as identifying something that we like or something that we don't like. It also releases neurotransmitters and natural opioids, and we can use it as a point for a reward or also a point for a bribe. And if you have ever had a children, sometimes that use of a food for a bribe is very much emphasized, especially by saying, for example, I'll give you that ice cream if you continue eating your broccoli, or if you finish eating your Brussels sprouts, etc. So there is a use of the food more complex than just having the food as a source of nutrients or as a point of nutrients. Then we move into the diet. So we're looking at a number of different food components that actually combines it all together and brings it as composition of what we are used to eating. And these dietary habits or the diets are looking at the food, drinks, supplements, everything that has been consumed at any point of time. So it can be something that you have consumed now, something that you have consumed in the past, or even something that you're planning on consuming. So it really links into that overarching definition of what a diet is and what the dietary habits. We developed the dietary habits based on the individual decisions. We also develop the dietary habits based on what a culture is choosing or what type of foods we are choosing to eat. As humans, we are omnivores. And there is a number of different cultural differences that hold the change for our food preferences, and even some of the food taboos, such as not eating a particular food item on a particular day due to the cultural or religious reason, or eating a particular food item on a particular time of the day because it is associated with X, Y, and Z, a variety of different reasons. Individual choices play a really significant importance on overall health, and individual choices can be less or more healthier. Usually, these individual choices are less healthier options just because of the availability of the food items and availability of the food that has been presented to us. When we talk about the diet as well, we also have to look at the proper nutrition, and a proper nutrition has been taken up to the next level of defining what a proper is and what really is applicable as a proper nutrition, because from the scientific perspective, the proper nutrition actually requires the adequate amounts of micronutrients and also the macronutrients, carbs, proteins, fats. And by taking these appropriate ratios, we can actually induce a different physiological states. We can also induce different mental health aspects and health preferences that can also determine the future outcomes of the individuals or of the groups themselves. So the overall health and the eating patterns, why are they so important, and why do they actually look so rapidly changing? So the earlier regional dietary patterns have already been described to explain some of the cross-cultural variations in the prevalence of age-related chronic diseases in particular. So, for example, the original Eskimo diet and the Japanese diet are both characterized by relatively high intakes of fish, which is thought to explain the low rate of development of coronary heart disease in this population, and also low rates of anxiety and depression in these type of populations. However, later, some of the cross-cultural studies, such as the 7-country studies that initiated in the late 1950s, has actually suggested that the fish intake itself might not be that important, because fish consumption was not consistently associated with mortality patterns across the countries, where the low intakes of saturated fats may further explain the reduced mortality risk. And that gave a raise to the Mediterranean diet, which is characterized by a high intake of vegetables, fruit, grains, fish, olive oil, and has received most attention in relation to mortality, because really the intriguing differences in a chronic disease prevalence and mortality statistics that have been showing up in Mediterranean populations and also are relative to the other parts of the world. And this type of data, this type of statistics has actually been acknowledged since the period of a Renaissance. So it is not something that is brand new. It is not something that we are seeing now. We are seeing more of it now due to the ways of communication and due to the way of describing the current situation. More recently, this importance of a diet has been further recognized in other parts of the world, where the populations exhibit great healthy aging, such as living longer without disabilities, and being more physically active, even after the age of, even over the age of 90, I should say. For example, the population groups in Sardinia in Italy, and Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, in Loma Linda, California, and Okinawa, Japan, have reported longer life expectancies and lower rates of these age-related diseases, including the cardiovascular disease, depression, and dementia, in comparison to the other countries. And these areas have been designed as the so-called blue zones and are part of the very large research projects to discovering a variety of different lifestyle factors that are associated with this extended and a better quality of life that is being produced in these countries. What is really interesting is that even without different ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds, the individuals that are living in these blue zones, they share a really common lifestyle characteristic, and mainly includes a diet that are rich in plant-based foods, such as vegetables, beans, soybeans, lentils, and are relatively low in meat. So they are not completely meat excluding, but they are relatively low in the meat consumption. And this was also consistent with a number of different studies that have been looking at a variety of different risks of mortality and cardiometabolic disease and poor cognitive outcomes that are associated with a higher intakes of different types of food, such as a lower intake of plant-based foods and relatively low meat consumption. Sorry, high intake of plant-based foods and low meat consumption. So that again gives a raise of the concept of Mediterranean diet. And what is really important is that when we talk about a Mediterranean diet, it's not a diet only. It's not a food per se. It is not just what you're consuming. And you have got some of the beautiful photographs in here and a lovely locally grown food. It is the whole concept of the lifestyle of what the people are doing over there. Mediterranean diet obviously is a very diverse. It encompasses a region that surrounds the Mediterranean Sea, and it includes a number of different oils and a number of different foods that have been traditionally consumed within a region. So it's a very regional concept of food growth, food transport, food consumption. So and seasonality of the food, what is also really important. From the diet perspective, or from the food consumption, obviously in this type of a region, there's a high intake of plant-based foods and the seafood. And myself, I actually come from this region, and these are the photographs of my hometown in called Split in Croatia. And it's when all this hassle with the current pandemic is over, I would strongly encourage you to go and visit this city, because it's absolutely beautiful, and you can still see some of the markets being where the local guys are bringing their own food products that have been grown into their own backyards, and they're selling them out on the market. So you really can't get more regional than what it is. What is really interesting is that in this type of a region, there's also low intake of red and processed meats and sweets. So me growing up as a child, for me, the sweet was, or a lolly was, to actually have a piece of a fruit, rather than have a chocolate, or rather than have a lollipop or a high sugar density type of a food product. Also, when we talk about a Mediterranean diet, we look at communal meal times. So sharing of the meals and having that association with sharing the meal with the other person, because there are a number of different studies that have indicated that sharing of a meal actually produces endorphins, and the endorphins further on, are feel-good hormones, are actually the ones that produce the levels of satiety as well. So when you're eating with somebody else, when you're sharing the meal, not only that you're going to share the good quality product, you're also going to have the physiological response where you would be able to eat less, but eat a better quality. Obviously, it's very known for resting after eating, or for the afternoon siestas. And me remembering as a kid, from 3 to 5 in the afternoon, it was a time where no kid was allowed on the street, because that was when the adults would go and have a siesta. And you were not allowed to make any kind of a noise or any racket. And regular physical activity. And a physical activity doesn't have to be going to the gyms or going for a workout. The physical activity is simply just standing up, going to the shopping, getting the groceries, walking up the stairs, performing a basic incidental physical activity, rather than actually having a planned stage outcomes of the physical activity itself. So what does the science say? Well, number of different beneficial effects. It is actually rather rare to find a negative effect of a Mediterranean diet. And if I have literally went out of my way to see if I can find a negative effect of the Mediterranean diet, because everybody talks about its benefits. One of the negative effects of the Mediterranean diets is that it can be perceived as being rather expensive, and it is a time demanding. So you really do have to pose a different cultural and a social approach to the whole food and dietary and the diet habits when you're implementing this type of a lifestyle, because again, it's not a diet, it is a lifestyle that people are living in this type of a region. I listed only just a brief information about what are some of the positive effects, and that is, reduction of progression of mild cognitive impairment, reduction in systemic inflammation, high antioxidant levels, and antioxidant levels were known to be lower in the brains of people with dementia in comparison to the people that are healthy. It improves the glucose metabolism, A low adherence to Mediterranean diet is also associated with the brain atrophy, so the brain shrinkage. And it's the studies from, in particular, the studies from the guys in Melbourne at the Deakin University by Professor Felice Jacka and the colleagues over there, they have actually shown that there are improvements in the mood and reduced anxiety, which then leads into the further question as to what have we been doing? So if all this is happening, the guys in my research group, we have done a number of different studies with the colleagues in the Mediterranean region at the Harokopio University of Athens, led by Professor Demosthenes Panagiotakos, where we looked at the association between the sleeping time metabolic syndrome in all the adults that are living in this region. But we also looked at the Mediterranean diet on the rheumatoid arthritis in prevention and treatment, cardiovascular disease prevention, the role of Mediterranean diet on association between some of the cardiovascular disease risk markers in a particular region. So a number of different studies from the different regions and also that we have been involved in have shown, obviously, beneficial health effects. So that is enough about Mediterranean diet. It's obviously one of the top world rated, the best type of a dietary pattern, dietary lifestyle that everybody should be on. But the problems can arise a bit later. And I will discuss that a little bit later of what are some of the problems in how to adhere with this. So another type of a diet that has actually shown quite importance in a regulation of cognition and mental health overall is a MIND diet. And MIND diet is actually a modified version of the dietary approach to the systolic hypertension of a DASH diet. And this type of a diet emphasis is on lean meats, fish, whole grain, fresh produce, olive oil, low sodium, salt. And the main difference from the Mediterranean diet is actually does not encourage the consumption of fruits, dairy, or potatoes. But on the other side, it actually encourages us high consumption of berries and leafy green vegetables. It also aims to eliminate red meats, not to completely eliminate, but to definitely reduce them down to the bare minimum. Butter, some of the margarines, cheese, pastry, sweets, fried and fast foods. And some of the observational studies have also indicated that high versus low adherence have shown a better cognitive performance and slower rate of cognitive decline. The Australian study of looking about 12 years have actually indicated that high adherence actually reduces the odds of cognitive impairment. However, there is no evidence that it helps people with the mild cognitive impairment, and in some cases with people with Alzheimer's disease. However, only medium levels of adherence may be needed to observe the benefits, which is then a good side of it as well. So you really don't have to be religiously following it in order to exhibit a beneficial health effects. The ketogenic diets are also, although they have been classed and are relatively new kids on the block, they have been there for quite some time, and they have shown their benefits in particular in rescuing the brain energy metabolism, because the ketone bodies, they can cross the blood-brain barrier. And they can actually do that and also rescue the brain metabolism. A lower glucose uptake in the brain and mild cognitive impairment and early Alzheimer's disease have actually been shown to also be present. And then we can lead it into the nutritional ketosis, such as a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diets that can actually be characterized by very low or to low carbohydrate intake and very low to moderate protein intake. There's a current evidence for people in Alzheimer's disease, and a number of studies have actually even proposed that over a 3-month period, there's improvements with the diets that are rich in vegetables and avocado itself, which is again sources of rather quite a good fats, and it can actually after it has been stopped, these beneficial effects disappear about a month later, which can also pose a problem as to if you're on a ketogenic diet, then you might be excluding a number of different nutrients. So the short-term benefits are present and short-term benefits are obviously evident and could be used if it has been carefully designed in order to maintain the overall health and maintain the overall brain health. Again, the modified Atkins diet in the 6-week study improved the memory, but the numbers of these type of studies that are published in the literature, or number of people participating in these type of studies, are still relatively low in order for us to basically definitely say that, yes, this type of a diet has definitely have got an influence onto the mental health outcomes. The plant-based diets, there is no causal link between the plant-based diets and the brain health. But it's more sort of a link that has been associated with a reduction in inflammation or inflammatory status, circulating inflammatory markers such as the TNF-alpha, IL-6, high-sensitive CRP protein. It can also improve the weight status, obviously because of the different pathways and metabolisms involved from the digestion perspective of the plant-based food products. It can also improve the energy metabolism. What is really interesting is the Michael Pollan, who is actually the father of the Mediterranean diet, or the blue zones, so the individual who has identified the blue zones, has even he himself basically said, eat food, not too much, mostly plants, in order to benefit. In addition to that, he also did mention that what is really interesting is from the sanitarian perspective is that, and I'm quoting this, he actually said that in order to be a sanitarian, you need 100 years of life. You don't do that over 4 weeks, over 12 weeks. So in order to become a sanitarian, to become a healthy sanitarian, you need 100 years of a life. So in the other words, what it means is you really do need to adhere to this type of a dietary pattern over a prolonged period of a time, rather than looking at a short bursts that may be effective, but it can also give you the false positive outcomes. Which can really trick you into the further problems. Then again, we have got the anti-inflammatory diet that involves eating nutrient-rich whole foods that reduce the inflammation in the body. It contains plenty of fiber, antioxidants, omega-3s, and this means a diet rich in vegetable, whole fruit, grains, legumes, and fatty fish. That is as unprocessed as possible. And I really cannot emphasize more about a consumption of the fatty fish, sardines, salmon, tuna, a fish like that. That is really as less processed as possible in order to get. And I'll talk about the processed foods later. So when we talk about anti-inflammatory foods, there's a number of different foods that can be included, a variety of different types of fruits and vegetables. Current terminology to use is a rainbow of veggies that provide a phytonutrients with a minimum of 4 to 5 servings per day, especially the dark leafy greens like spinach, kale, rocket, Asian greens, broccoli, the Brussels sprouts, things like that, and even a beetroot that in Australia is consumed obviously to an excess. We even put it on hamburgers. So it is a really the more colorful vegetables you have got, the better it is. From the fruit consumption, we'll talk mainly about the whole pieces of fruit. We're not talking about juice because the juices are traditionally stripped from the fiber unless it is a home juice method where you really do require to consume a fiber itself when it has got a pulp in it. And also when we talk about the fruit juice, it's a quantity again that we are consuming. So just to give an example, in order to make 1 glass of the orange juice, you would need about 4 to 5 oranges to be juiced in order to get your standard or 250, 300 ml glass. And that is easily drunk. I mean, you can just grab a glass like this and drink it. There's no problem at all. The problem arises is that you actually can't eat 4 to 5 oranges in one sitting. Or you can. If you can't eat them, it's really hard. So that ratio of and the quantity of the foods that we are consuming, whether they're processed or non-processed, is quite different. Also, consumption of nuts and seeds, walnuts, almonds, pistachios, pine nuts, chia nuts, hemp seeds, I'm not sure if the hemp hemp seeds are actually allowed for consumption in some of the countries. In Australia, it was only relatively recently that the hemp seeds have been listed as available on the market. So they were available to be sold for human consumption. And obviously consumption of, the whole grains, brown rice, quinoa, buckwheats, legumes and beans, and water. Quite a lot of water consumption is also needed, especially if you're on a high fiber diet. And there is a lot of indication about some of the hot beverages, such as green tea consumption and consumption of coffee, not an instant one, but rather the whole roasted coffee made from the coffee beans themselves. So we now talked about diets that are beneficial for health and the diets that have shown quite a good response for the overall health, including the mental health. But it's also time to talk about some of the problems that are associated with Western diets, and some of the problems that are really particular and peculiar that we are finding out on the market, that there is a high intake of ultra-processed foods. And that includes discretionary foods, processed meats, refined non-intake grains, sugar-sweetened beverages. And what we also are seeing is a very low intake of fruits, vegetables, high alcohol intake, and high prevalence of smoking. Now, there's some of the studies that have actually came up that pre-COVID situation, there was up to 40 to 45% of the overall energy intake being attributed to the processed and ultra-processed foods, which is absolutely enormous. I mean, when you think about it, a half of the food that the population is eating comes from these ultra-processed foods that can cause, obviously, a negative health impact. And when we talk about this processed and ultra-processed foods, we're also seeing the countries of the Mediterranean region where we are seeing all these benefits, a higher increase in the westernized foods. And what is really interesting to say is that Mediterranean diet actually is not consumed anymore even in the regions where it originates from, because of this transition to the fast industrial-based food and processed products. Now, when I talk about this, I also would like to emphasize there is absolutely nothing wrong in processing the foods. Processing of the foods is required in order to reduce the food waste and in order to reduce the impact on the environment, and et cetera, et cetera. But the consumption of these high ultra-processed foods should be reduced down to the really lower levels. From the ultra-processed foods, the classification of these type of foods is really performed by the NOMA classification, which is not an acronym for anything. It's more sort of a name. And it's designed into the 4 separate categories, such as unprocessed, minimally processed, processed culinary ingredients, and then processed foods. And then we have got these ultra-processed foods where we have got a number of different substances that are derived from the foods or additives. And those kind of foods that you will see, those type of additives, is in order to capture that would be the best way to describe it is as if you have not cooked or if you don't have that type of ingredient in a pantry or in your food storage cabinet, it is most probably, and if it's listed on a food ingredients list, it's most probably the ultra-processed food. So it includes a number of different emulsifiers, a number of different salt enhancers, flavor enhancers, et cetera, et cetera. So there's still the food products that are available on the market. They're available and legal to be used in food production, et cetera. But they're finding the use more and more in a usual food consumption. Consequently, this has got an effect, or these type of poor diets have got the effects on our brain, among everything else. And that can be done by the neuroinflammation, brain insulin resistance. It also poses the effect on a gut-brain axis, and it's relatively influenced by the genetics as well. So from the blood-brain barrier itself is a perfectly designed barrier between the circulatory system and the cerebrospinal component or neuronal system. And it really works as an interaction between two systems. And it's designed to protect the brain from immune and inflammatory responses. What is interesting as well is that these acute or short-term attacks on the brain through the stress, through the food intake, through medication, through supplementation, through exposure to the different types of environmental stressors, etc., are actually generally neutralized with the minimal damage to our brains. However, the chronic attacks or chronic insults, they can lead to neuronal cell damage and neurodegeneration, which can cause a detrimental and cause different types of health effects. From the brain, insulin resistance, deteriorating brain energy metabolism is a pre-symptomatic problem that increases the risk of developing cognitive and mental health problems, and also can impact on various mental health conditions. It is more common in the people with high genetic risks and the people with a family history of a different type of genetic predispositions for mental health issues or mental health problems, or individuals that are genetically predisposed to the development of a cognitive, later on cognitive related problems. And this insulin resistance occurs when the brain cells have got a difficulty in utilizing a glucose, because a glucose is obviously one of the primary sources for a brain energy metabolism, and it really is required in order for a brain to function relatively adequately, although the brain can utilize the ketone bodies as well to function. But glucose is always seen as a favorable effect for a brain to function normally. You don't need much, I really have to admit that. You do not require a lot of glucose for a brain to function adequately, but some glucose is still required for the normal regulation. The insulin in the brain, it also controls the food intake, and it also regulates the cognitive functions as well. So it does play quite an importance from the overall perspective of the brain health. And then it links us to the connection between the gut and the brain. A number of relatively recent studies have been implicated in the gut-brain axis as a key mechanism for transmitting the information from the gut to the brain via the vagus nerve. And the gut-brain axis is emerging as the fundamental conduit for the transfer of neural signals, informing the brain of the metabolic and physiologic states of the body. And this communication is also dependent on several crucial elements, such as the composition of the gut microbiota, intestinal wall integrity, neurotransmitters, hormones, and a number of different peptides that are produced in the gut itself. And when you look at the human gut actually hosts 100 trillion bacteria. And these bacteria will eventually fall in about 500 to 1,000 bacterial species. The microbial density and the diversity are established very rapidly in the gut of the newborn. And obviously when the newborn is actually born, they're born with a sterile gut under quotation marks. And they start building up their gut microbiota and the gut bacteria even during the process of birth. So, and this really have got an onset once they are being breastfed. So the whole gut microflora, it starts being built up from the time zero of the newborn. The gut microbiota is also, or gut microbiota diversity rather, and composition are also affected by the genetic background, and most importantly, by the diet and by the environment. There are some age-related changes in microbiota due to the physiological, lifestyle, health status, and each of these factors is further associated with the changes in relative abundance of some members of the microbiota. And some behavioral, metabolic, and physiological mechanisms might explain the observed increases or decreases as well. So there's a number of different aspects that will contribute to these type of changes. The dynamic nature of the microbiota in early life is relatively well known, and some of the subtle changes actually in diversity continue until the middle age, approximately 40 years in the humans, at which point there is a period of very relative stability, and this point of stability is lost Soon as we start getting the age-related dysbiosis begin, and it will vary from individual, and it's obviously influenced as a consequences due to the physiological changes that can correlate with more biological age, such as physiological age rather than the actual chronological age, which would relate to the time in a life, such as a 40, 30, 50, 70 years old, etc. This distangling of the relative contribution of the age, medication, diet, and number of different comorbidities is a challenging, but this age-related change has been reported in model organisms as well, such as mice, fish, fruit flies, and similarly large and a very careful investigation of adults that live with various health conditions also account for a diet, lifestyle, and medication. And there is observed aspect that the gut microbiota will increase or decrease depending on the severity of the health status and the quality of the health status itself. So all this is obviously shaped by a large part physiology, a large part diet, a large part medication, activity, even exercise can actually induce changes in the gut microbiota. And by having this type of a change in the gut microbiota can consequently lead to the changes in the physiology and psychological responses as well of the individuals. That is why me as a food scientist and a nutritionist, we are really paying the specific focus on the gastrointestinal tract. So the gastrointestinal tract, it's literally the bullseye for a food scientist and for the nutritionist. We obviously know that a good nutrition is vital for our health and optimal growth. And this gastrointestinal tract is really the interface between a diet and metabolic events. So if we have got a steady dietary intake and if we can target the gastrointestinal tract, we can effectively produce the metabolic response, hopefully good one. And obviously we are all working as a scientist and as a researchers, we're also working to produce the good effects for the health reasons. That brings us to the information about the bioactives. And we have talked about the different compilations of foods. We have talked about different diets and the dietary patterns. But now from this type of diets and the dietary patterns, we are really trying to identify individual compounds that can assist us with producing a desired beneficial health effect in human populations much faster than adhering to these long-term diets. Now, in saying that, I'm not completely disagreeing with the diets, but from the human perspective, from the current status, it's really hard to change somebody's diet. And there's a typical pattern in the Western society that we're always looking for a pill or for a tablet that is going to help us and that is going to cure us of all the illnesses, to find that panacea of a health. We always relate to some of the compounds such as the polyphenols. And probably you guys have heard about the polyphenols, and the polyphenols are very ubiquitous compounds. They are plant secondary metabolites. Today, there is over 8,000 of different compounds identified, from very simple to exceptionally complex structures. And the food sources includes apples, pears, grapes, red wine, a number of different food products. And they are all, this type of foods, they really have got a high content of polyphenols. And all these foods have already been listed as being consumed in regions where are beneficial health effects. So the theoretical perspective would be that if we can concentrate these type of foods and put them into the diet, maybe we can exhibit a beneficial health effects in the populations that are really hard to stick to these type of diets and dietary patterns. No matter what, these type of health compounds have become the leads for the functional food product development. And the functional food product development leads to the implementation of individual compounds, putting them into the foods in order to assist with the desired health outcome. From the anthocyanins, from the polyphenolic perspective, the anthocyanins are ones that have seen the most sharp rise in research and the most observable effect on mental health and cognitive performance. Relatively recently, we have looked at the effects of blueberry interventions on cognitive performance and mood. We have performed a systematic literature review of large randomized control trials, and there was an indication that blueberries and the blueberry products could have an improvement in the cognition and the mental health, and improvements in the performance and the performance of the mood. What is really interesting about this is that we could only ascribe that to the anthocyanin composition of the blueberries, which further indicates that these blue pigmented type of chemicals or bioactives can actually assist in a maintenance of the neuronal tissue, in maintenance of the brain health, in a maintenance of the overall antioxidant status. And they are relatively easy to be consumed because you only require a smaller amount of berries over a prolonged period of time. So again, brings us back to that dose response question as to whether we should consume the excessive amounts or should we consume the relatively manageable and enjoyable components over a prolonged period of time to produce a rather beneficial health effects later on in the life. Then on the market, the curcumin, about a couple of years ago or 3 years ago in Australia, the curcumin was hitting the market, and every health food store and anything that was selling a different so-called health food product have been really pushing for a curcumin to actually say, yes, this is the panacea for everything. It's going to lower the Alzheimer's pathology, is going to improve the gastrointestinal effects. It's got antioxidant status, anti-inflammatory, you name it. It was the best thing since sliced bread that actually appeared on the market. Fair enough. Yep, there was no problem regards that. There were some positive studies, so some studies that have shown a positive effect. But one of the main problems with the curcumin is that it really requires excessive doses. So I always find it interesting when, the celebrity chefs, in particular here in Australia, there's a whole a group of the celebrity chefs that would basically say, oh, I'm going to prepare a curry and I'm going to put a pinch of a turmeric in a curry because it has got a beneficial health effect. What's really funny is that pinch of a turmeric being put into the curry for a once off is not going to do any potentially beneficial health effects overall to the person that is consuming it. Because obviously when you're cooking a curry, you're cooking in a larger pot. So, one curry would be maybe serve 4 to 6 people. So you really need the mega doses in order to exhibit a beneficial health effects, which again links us back to that a dose time consumption. We performed also, the guys from a research group, we also looked at potential health effects on a curcumin. And until then, there was only 6 randomized controlled trials that have been conducted and have shown the better results, obviously with a higher bioavailability, which means that more of the curcumin you are bringing in, the more of the response you're going to have. There was also a synergistic effect, meaning working together with another compounds, in particular with the omega-3 fatty acids. And there is really an underlying cause for it because curcumin is very fat soluble or oil soluble. So if you can dissolve something in oil, you have got a higher tendency to actually deliver it to the better quality to the consumer that is actually taking it in. But all this disregards that. It also pauses the effect on the gut microbiota, and whether the curcumin really improves the gut microbiota, whether it improves the diversity and functionality of the gut, and by doing so links to the brain, it's just yet to investigate it. So it's really a very complex mechanism of action that a curcumin may have in order to produce the beneficial health effects. Linking back to something that is really a blast from the past, a folate supplementation, and folate supplementation is being introduced in mandatory folate fortification in Australia has been introduced since 2011. So all of the breads and the flours that are not organic flours now have to contain a specific amount of folic acid, in order to prevent the development of neural tube defects. And what is really interesting is that the folate interacts also with a homocysteine, and a homocysteine is an amino acid that has been associated independently with the development of cardiovascular disease. Every time that I say cardiovascular disease, also think about mental health problems, because it's a requirement for the brain to actually have the vasculature so you can supply the nutrients to the brain and to the nervous system as well. So high levels of folic acid theoretically should reduce the inflammatory response and should also reduce the development of anxiety and depression, which we have only seen on the borderline after performing some of the reviews. So although the folic acid has got a beneficial, or folate supplementation has got a beneficial effects onto the overall cardiovascular health, there may not be associations with improvements in mental health itself. Then it brings us to the story about the theanine, which is a non-proteinous amino acid. It's really a compound that I thoroughly enjoy working with. We have done, my team and myself, we have done quite a lot of research on the background of the theanine, because it comes from the green tea. It's a non-proteinous amino acid, which means it's not one of those essential or non-essential amino acids that is actually found in a green tea, and it's found in some species of the mushrooms, but majority of it is found in a green tea. And what we have also observed is that number of studies have also identified that there is a dose-dependent identification in hypotensive properties, which means it can lower the blood pressure. And again, if you link it back to the cardiovascular disease, hypertension or high blood pressure is also associated with individuals having a higher anxiety levels and also having a high depressive symptoms. What is a good thing about this from preliminary studies also that it negates the caffeine-induced effects. So if you're having a cup of coffee and you have a theanine, a specific dose, you would be able to reduce that heart palpitations. You would be able to reduce the rise in our blood pressure, to suppress rather than to reduce. It has got a very interesting structure, and because of this structure, it's able to actually pass the blood-brain barrier. And not only by passing the blood-brain barrier, it's also able to actually show that there is a change in inflammatory response, in a circulatory inflammatory response. And in here, I'm presenting the findings from a colleague of mine, Domenico Sergi, that has been working at a CSIRO in Adelaide, and now he's at the University of Toronto in Canada. And we have been collaborating on this type of projects for quite some time. So we can observe that there is quite a significant reduction in TNF-alpha, which is an inflammatory response in hypothalamic cell lines, which leads us further to how we can actually utilize this compound potentially for the benefits of the neuronal structures. And here you have got an example of the fluorescence microscopy of hypothalamic neuronal mitochondria, where we have been staining it using different types of trackers. In summary, the red color corresponds to the mitochondria, and images are representative of different treatments used. So in the case in here for image A, we have treated the cells with a palmitic acid, which is a negative control. We wanted to induce the damage to these cell lines. On image B, we have got the bovine serum albumin, which means the cells were treated with a vehicle control or something that you should not induce the problems to the mitochondria. We also used the palmitic acid, which is a negative compound or a bad guy, in the presence of the L-theanine, which is the image C. And we also use the palmitic acid in the presence of epigallocatechin 3-O-gallate, which is one of the major polyphenols from the green tea. And what is really interesting about this is that on image C, you can still see the mitochondria being healthy, still see the mitochondria in a hypothalamic cell lines, it still functions in comparison to the most potent antioxidant that we have, that we can derive from the green tea. Therefore, linking it back that the beneficial health effects of the actual green tea consumption might be from the amounts of theanine that are found. But obviously, we can't interpret this and we can't translate this in vitro studies of what we see in dish to the real human studies. It only provides us with the potential mechanisms of action, which is, again, I think, a very interesting point of view. Then we said, hang on a second, let's see how we can actually see if there are any beneficial health effects of these amino acids in animal models. So let's see what the animal studies have to say and what are the potential for utilizing this type of a product in for a human consumption. Then we looked a next step further and we looked at, sorry, I'm going to go one slide back. So from the animal models, it has shown a number of different beneficial health effects ranging from reducing the anxiety and the depression to calming effect, to improvements in memory, improvements in a number of different physiological responses of the animal models. But that still doesn't tell us how is that going to work in the humans. So, the behavior of a mouse is completely different to the behavior of a human, which is obvious on all levels. But again, it provides a next step up to actually provide a potentially beneficial uses of these type of amino acids. When we move over to the human studies, we also performed looking at the ability to manage anxiety and stress in a human population, so where we use these pure green tea amino acids. And the summary of the studies have actually identified that there are a number of beneficial aspects associated with it, such as production of alpha waves, which are associated with a feeling of relaxation, without drowsiness, which is really also another important thing. The relaxation at various, whether the individual is in a resting or individual has been exposed to a different stimuli, such as running on a treadmill or physical measurement or physical induced stress that individual has to be exposed with, it still shows relaxations and improvements in a focus and concentration, which is, again, really important when you really consider these type of individual amino acids. Consequently, there was an improvement in the sleep quality. And that is in the clinical population, such as in boys diagnosed with ADHD, but also in individuals that they have got that are diagnosed with schizophrenia after 8 weeks of a supplementation. So of relatively manageable doses, of relatively standardized doses over a period of a time. So it does show that there is a potential for the use of these type of a nutraceutical for the improvements in the mental health. And then how does it all work? Well, the L-theanine might actually reduce the binding of a glutamine to glutamate receptors and inhibiting the incorporation of extracellular glutamine into the neuron, which then consequently can also assist with improvements in the quality of a neuron, so the overall health of the neuron. But it will have the effect on activation on postsynaptic glutamate receptors, which will lead into the relaxed state, which will lead into the non-drowsy, focused, relaxed state. It will be something after the consumption. It has commonly been described as something as if you have gone for a very long run, and when you have gone and you say, "Wow, that was absolutely fantastic." You go home, you have a shower, and you sit down, and you've got that tingling feeling in all over your body, and you're just feeling relaxed and satisfied with the achievement of what you have produced. So quite often, the sum of the doses can actually exhibit this type of a response. And then I bring this slide in. I didn't want to talk in specific about a bipolar disorder for the couple of reasons. Because first reason is I'm not a specialist in a bipolar disorder, and I don't have the bipolar disorder, and it's really hard for somebody who is a not specialist in a bipolar disorder from the pathophysiological perspective and from the treatment perspective to actually explain what is really good for individuals that are diagnosed with a bipolar. So I have brought this slide in because the colleagues in Melbourne, in particular, a very good colleague of mine, Wolfgang Marx, and a number of different colleagues that are listed on a slide in here, they have actually performed and published very recently a very good systematic literature review that looks at different types of nutraceuticals for the treatment of the bipolar disorder. The treatments related to bipolar disorder are rather challenging because the standard treatments have got a relatively limited efficiency, consequently resulting in a reduced overall quality of life. Most of these treatments are more efficient in the treatment of a mania stage rather than a depression, and the antidepressant treatments can, again, potentially cause a switch to the manic episode, which then leads to the questioning of a different type of a treatment. One of the rapidly rising research areas in nutritional psychiatry overall and in the potential treatments of bipolar disorder is also adjunctive use of nutraceuticals, as these compounds can target neurogenesis, inflammation, mitochondrial function, and all of these are somewhat dysregulated in the individuals that are living with a bipolar disorder. No matter what, this systematic literature review really reviewed about the 1,700 studies. They identified, 1,700 studies through the electronic database searches, and only 22 studies were included that fitted very rigorous criteria for the evaluation of the quality of the studies. And the findings were indicated a very large variability across the studies, with about 15 different nutraceuticals being used, and there is some conflicting evidence, some promising, but also conflicting evidence, in particular about the use of omega-3 fatty acids and acetylcysteine compounds. And again, some of the positive results relating to the coenzyme Q10. Again, as with most of these studies, we really do need a long-term trials and adequate doses that are required to really assess the efficacy and the safety of these type of nutraceuticals. Not only that, it's important to say, yes, this is efficient, we also have to make sure that it is safe and it is not going to cause a cascade of different events potentially over a period of time. So when you talk about the diets and the mental health, there is a paucity of RCTs investigating the effectiveness of a dietary change in the treatments of a number of various mental health aspects. One of the first intervention studies performed to date involved a 12-week Mediterranean diet with really a significant improvements in the mood and reduced anxiety levels in adults with major depression. More recent Mediterranean style diet on mental health in a depression, such as HealthyMed and PREDI-DEP studies, also showed positive outcomes. And important future steps will be towards the discoveries of the metabolic and cellular processes that connect nutrition to brain function in health, but also in the disease, because that is a rather different. And we really need to establish whether these sufficient nutrients, bioactives, nutraceuticals, dietary patterns, or whole foods are really a beneficial effects on the mental health, rather than just basically saying, yes, this is the cause and effect. It's really a bilateral relationship, bidirectional relationship that can influence a number of different changes later on in a life. We really have to start look at the optimizing a dose, timing, and other factors that are associated with the diet. When we talk about the nutraceuticals in the treatments of various mental health conditions, there's this area is still in its relative infancy, and we are really looking at very sharp rise in the utilization of these type of compounds in the overall health. Some of these, same as for the whole food interventions, includes the doses and interactions with the current overall food intake, health status, gut microbiota, timing, a number of different effects. On the other hand, some of the nutraceuticals, such as the theanine, have actually shown the effect, positive effects in acute supplementations, but we don't know what is going to happen and what quantities we really do require to see the greater and a longer effect. In some contrast as well, some of the compounds can actually exhibit a rather negative effects. And I cannot emphasize more, but the consultations between MD professionals and dietitians that are specializing in this area are of the utmost importance. So really, rather than going down a shop and buying the compounds and buying the supplements on your own is very much not advisable. I would strongly suggest that everyone should at least visit a dietitian or a medical doctor that can actually provide the adequate levels and adequate advice for these type of compounds, because these guys get trained for quite a significant amount of time and they have got a quite different areas of expertise. Which brings me basically to the end of the presentation, and I really do hope that I have not bored you, because I found this topic very fascinating and I can talk for hours and hours and hours, and I really sometimes do feel sorry for my students. But really this work would not be able to be done without collaborators and researchers involved. I have listed a number of different researchers from the University of Canberra: Stephen Isbell, Andrew McKeown, Dr. Jane Callett. And really, this presentation would not be able to be done without the PhD students, such as Nathan Acuna, Brittany Elizabeth, Abanda, and then some of our international collaborators as well, from the Harokopio University of Athens and from the University of Toronto and from Deakin University as well. And to finish this presentation off, I will leave you with some of the images that you will be able to find at where I'm located at University of Canberra. And I would really like to use this opportunity to thank you all for your kind invitation to present this very dear, fascinating, and really interesting topic. And I would also like to thank you for your time and attendance to this presentation. And here you would be able to actually see the images of the state-of-the-art rehabilitation, University of Canberra Hospital, and some images of our regular residents on a campus, and rather cheeky and very beautiful kangaroos. So once again, thank you very much for your time.